Good morning. My name is Mary Lee Donnelly, and I am your service leader this morning, and I use the pronouns she, her. Please silence your electronic devices. It sounds so ominous, but if it goes off, it really, you get embarrassed, so don't do that. We want to take a few moments to welcome any guests with us today. We're happy you're here. If this is your first time, your 100th time, or your 1000th time, we're very glad that you're here. If you would like to receive any communication about us, please complete the guest cards. They're found on the credenza, and you can return them to the greeters or leave them in the offering basket, or just leave them back on the credenza. We don't have a written order of service, but you have a folder that will give you some information about us and how we operate. And also inside there is a sheet that is meant for joys and sorrows. If you have a joy or a sorrow that you would like to share with the congregation, please fill that out and put it into the offering basket when that's passed around, and that will be read later in the service. And so, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Pensacola. Again, please finish arriving. The chalice lighting words this morning are by Bruce Southworth, a communion of heart and soul. For the gift of this day and for our community of spiritual nurture and compassion, we give thanks. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. May our many sparks meet and merge in communion of heart and soul. Please rise if you're willing and able to recite our covenant. The words are on the screen. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now we'll have a short time for all ages. And our guest speaker this morning, Harold Boy, will be telling a story, and we will be So pleased.
Thank you, Mary Lee. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I know generally this is the time for a story for children, and I really like having children coming up and talking to them. I've been a teacher, and I've been involved with children in various age groups, but this story, I'm not sure, maybe a little strong for children, I hope not, but it concerns, which I'm going to be talking about in my sermon, the most important event in my beloved Detroit, the history of Detroit, Michigan. It was the 1967 riot. And I take this story from Chicken Soup for the Soul. Are you familiar with this? Yeah. And this is Stories for a Better World. This is my favorite Chicken Soup book. They have, like Thich Nhat Hanh and, Desmond Tutu, people like that in here. But I'll just read the last part of the story. And the idea is that there's a riot, and if I were to explain to children, riot is where there's a lot of bad things happening, a lot of noise, fires, terrible things, people hurting each other. And in the midst of all this chaos, this rioting, we hear the story of a family. The father's named Carl Andreas. He's a United Auto Workers employee, has a wife and 2 sons. And he said this: "Our city was dying." By the way, they lived in Lafayette Park near downtown where the riot was taking place. Everywhere you looked, you could see fires or vestiges of fire, smoldering rubble, burned out hulks of buildings, charred timber where somebody's business or home once stood. It was so very painful. We didn't know what to do, but as a family, we knew we had to do something. We are Mennonites, not only committed to peace, but to the things that make for peace. But like everyone else, we were at loose ends. The Andreases tied up at least one of those loose ends when a single idea arose during dinner conversation one night. They made a sign. It read, "This house is unarmed." They hung it in the living room window, visible from the street. If nothing else, the sign at least gave us the opportunity to proclaim our nonviolence, Andreas observed. It was our own little witness, and if others wished to join us, well, they are welcome to do so. And so the message was born. Others did join them. Despite protests from some neighbors who feared it might attract trouble, a few more signs started appearing sporadically in living room windows, dotting the neighborhood, and the message spread. We then had a few printed up, maybe a dozen or so. They had an image of a dove and a home, in the words, of course, and we gave them out to friends, and so the message spread a little more. Eventually, one of the progressive churches in town took up the idea and actually printed quite a few. It may have been hundreds, maybe 1,000. I don't recall exactly how many, but I know it was more than we could have made. And the message spread a little more. An inspired idea became something of a movement, and for the duration of the unrest, all reports indicated that none of the houses that bore the signs were touched by so much as a scintilla of violence. Think of that. None of them were touched by violence. We so often believe that the great ideas can only come from great leaders, that effective protests can only be driven by saintly figures. How inspiring to realize that any one of us had the ability to imagine a workable solution, and can then turn that idea into powerful action. Most amazing of all, it was Andreas's 11-year-old son, a child, not the power and might of experience, who thought of the sign proclaiming, "This house is unarmed." This child's simple idea became the spark that gave protection and helped restore peace to a violence-torn city.
And now we'll sing the children out. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Our opening words this morning are by one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver. Why I Wake Early. Hello, sun in my face. Hello, you who made the morning and spread it over the fields and into the faces of the tulips and the nodding morning glories and into the windows of even the miserable and crotchety. Best preacher that ever was, dear star, that just happens to be where you are in the universe to keep us from ever darkness, to ease us with warm touching, to hold us in the great hands of light. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Watch now how I start the day in happiness and kindness. Our hymn this morning is number 347, Gather the Spirit. And rise if you would like to.
They don't put the words up there?
No, they all have hymns.
Yeah. Gather the Spirit. Again.
Now is the time in our service where we gather an offering. This congregation is fully supported by contributions by members, guests, and friends. Oh, and if you have a joy or a sorrow, please put them into the offering basket. Now we will have our joys and sorrows, and could I get somebody to help me light the candles as I read the joys and sorrows. One sorrow for our congregation, but a joy to the Levitt's family, is that they are moving to the Washington, D.C. area with a new job. So if you have an opportunity to communicate with them before they go, I'm sure they would appreciate that. Nadine Hubble is recovering from shoulder surgery, so I'm sure she would appreciate cards for that. And Muffy Ryland also, she had hip surgery, and she is recovering from that and would probably appreciate a call or a card or something from anyone. And we have guests today. Leland and Nita Mott would like to lift up a friend and pastor of the First Christian Church of Disciples in Decatur, Georgia, is battling with colon cancer. Our hearts go out to that. Now and one last candle for all the joys and sorrows that are in your hearts but left unspoken. And now I will introduce our guest speaker today, Harold Boy. He's been here previously, I think the last time in 2019. We have had a blank space between 2020 and 21. But I'm glad to have him return. He is a retired Unitarian Universalist.
Well, again, thank you, Mary Lee. It is a pleasure to be here once again. I thought I'd begin, these are singing bowls, right? You know how that works? But you know that if you stand under a Buddhist bell right in the center, you ring it, you don't hear anything. It's big. But the idea, you ring the bell, and then the tone dissipates. It gets softer and softer and softer. And actually, it never really disappears. It's just the energy just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I kind of think of that as like our transition, into the other side, what we call life and what we call death. It's like, your energy is never totally destroyed, right? But anyway, I thought we could begin with this exercise where you just listen to the tone and follow it. Just follow it deeper and deeper. So here, let's do that. I'll do it with the microphone. Let us gently come back into the sanctuary and be among friends. A guru was once asked, how many religions are there in the world? I wonder if you have any idea how many religions there are. What number would you put to that? Yeah, he stole my thunder. Yep, he said 7 billion. One for every man, woman, and child. Now that's interesting to me, but even more interesting is that linguists said essentially the same thing about languages. There's 7 billion languages in the world for every man, woman, and child. And so what is amazing about communications is that we can understand each other, or we think we do. But if we listen with all our heart and mind and spirit, I think we can come close to understanding. So it is impossible for me to know what you're thinking and what you're feeling. We're all unique. We're unique in our thoughts and our feelings, our experiences. It's impossible to understand anyone completely. Heck, I have a hard time understanding my wife from time to time. But I share with you something I find interesting, and it must come from within me. I can only speak for myself, and when I craft a sermon, it must be from my authentic self. And so I find something interesting with the idea that perhaps you will find it interesting too. And if just one of you finds something of use in my sermon today, I will have succeeded in my mission. Recently, I found something interesting in the December newsletter of my church, the Unitarian Universalist Community Church of Southwest Michigan, in Portage, Michigan. That's quite a mouthful. And it was a column by our RE director, religious education director, and office manager, Miriam Eskamp. She recited the words from the hymn, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day, number 240 in our hymnal. And then she gives a reflection on those words. So first, the words from the carol. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, a peace on earth to all goodwill. And this is Miriam's reflection. Peace seems like an appropriate theme for December. It goes hand in hand with the holiday season with its messages of peace on earth, goodwill to all. The ideal of peace on earth is also part of the fabric of Unitarian Universalism. Our Unitarian Universalist principles call on us to help build a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Our principles remind us of the interwoven nature of peace. Peace and injustice cannot coexist. Justice requires an inner revolution of more loving kindness towards ourselves and others. It is as Lao Tzu said, if there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the heart. Peace requires work. Work to find peace within and to build peace and justice in our families, communities, and the world. As you weave your tapestry of life, what role will peace play in your design? These are noble thoughts by Miriam. She has given us our aspiration of our religion and as people. However, I know something of the context of those words, that old Christmas carol. It came from a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Henry wrote this poem in 1863 at the height of the Civil War, the greatest crisis we ever had in our history. It was a dark time for himself, for his family, and for our nation. In 1835, his first wife, Mary Storer Potter, of 4 years, they were married for 4 years, died shortly after she had a miscarriage. However, in 1839, he met Frances Appleton. And after, he was smitten from the very beginning. And so he courted her for 4 years. Can you imagine? And they finally got married in 1843. They had a happy, blessed marriage for 18 years, and they were blessed with 6 children. One can imagine a happy scene on Christmas Day in 1860, the Longfellow family, amidst a quaint, lovely New England winter. But the next year brought tragedy for Henry. In July of 1861, Frances died from her dress catching fire as she was putting sealing wax on envelopes. Henry tried to extinguish the flames, and he failed. But he became so burned that he could not even attend his own wife's funeral. He, on account of the burns, he stopped shaving. And so he grew a beard, and that's the countenance that we're familiar with when we see Longfellow. At times he feared that he would be sent to asylum on account of his grief. Then in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, Longfellow's oldest son, Charles Appleton Longfellow, joined the Union Army without his father's consent. For even though Longfellow was an abolitionist, he was also a pacifist. And we can imagine that Henry suffering so much grief from the loss of his wife that if he lost his son in war, that would be almost unbearable. Charles suffered a major wound in the war, and he came back, and Henry nursed him back to health. It was during this time that Henry wrote the poem on Christmas Day in 1863, which he called Christmas Bells. In 1872, the English organist John Baptiste Culkin put the poem to music. So I'm going to sing the first stanza. I won't try your patience so much, but I want to sing because the original tune that I'm familiar with, which I like, the tune in the hymnal is not the same. And I'm not a big fan of that tune. And also we can note that I'm going to read Longfellow's poem the way he wrote it. So he's going to use masculine nouns and pronouns to refer to all humans. And of course, many of us, that's what we were taught. My 7th grade teacher, Miss Caltrow, made that very clear to us. You know, when unidentified pronoun, you use he or him. So anyway, this is the first stanza in the old tune. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then the rest of the poem and thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Now these are beautiful words, they're aspirational. They speak to the best of the human spirit. But then the poem takes a decidedly dark tone in feeling. And by the way, the stanzas I'm going to read to you are often excluded when people sing this carol at Christmas time. But remember the time that he wrote this. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with a sound the carols drowned, a peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent, made forlorn the households born, a peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song, a peace on earth, goodwill to men. As much as I would like to believe otherwise, I know Longfellow is right, that hate is strong and mocks the song of peace and goodwill. I learned in studying political science that politics is all about power. And I remember one of my professors saying that power is the ability to get another person or persons to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do on their own. So there are many ways of attempting to try to make people do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do on their own. One would be the use of persuasion, which I'm trying to do today. But there are other stronger methods, often harsh methods, terrible methods, methods of threat, physical threat, psychological threat, economic threat. And we can note that the settlers came to this continent and many other continents, and they forced the native people off their land. They made them do something that they would not have done on their own. And not only did they evict them, they oppressed them and sometimes massacred them. And why do people do these terrible things? Because they love power. They love power. And they justify the use of power in many ways. For example, one way they justify their power is by religion, saying that religion says it's right for them to do this. Another way is that they say they're a superior people, overtaking a more primitive people. That gives them the right to do these terrible things. Yes, it's a dark story, a very human story. The anguish Henry felt both personally and for his nation, expressed in his poem, reflects this dark side of humanity. It seems to me that we're living in a dark time today. Certainly our time is not as momentous as the Civil War, but I still worry about what's happening to us. There's much that can be overwhelming, at least to me. The climate crisis, the pandemic, the rise in crime and gun deaths, problems with excessive police tactics, problems with our economy, the loss of our democracy, and so on. And because we're losing the ability to work together, the ability to identify our problems, to look at all the factors contribute to the problems, those problems, and to analyze them and to come up with some solutions, we're heading for a catastrophe. And it will not be people of my generation who will suffer much. It will be my children and all parents' children in future generations who will suffer. Now, my wife, Julie, sees the situation differently. She points out that in our lifetime, we lived through crises. Example of the Vietnam War and the conflict around the civil rights movement, the rise in crime, the various scandals that visited the White House, assassinations, environmental disasters, the lack of progress in ending poverty and income disparity, and so on. And still somehow we survived. My wife makes a good point. It's something that we should be mindful of. And I must say that my wife, Julie, is not a worrier, not like I am. But still, this time feels different to me than the past crises I experienced in my lifetime. And I'm not alone. This opinion piece in the New York Times by Michelle Goldberg. Do you know Michelle Goldberg? Read the New York Times? Anyway, the piece is called The Mental Health Toll of the Trump-Era Politics. I'm interested in the role politics plays in the disastrous state of American mental health, which is one of the overarching stories in the country right now. For all our division, there's pretty broad consensus that our country is psychologically in an awful place. According to a recent U.S. Today poll, almost 9 in 10 registered voters believe there's a mental health crisis in America. 9 in 10. This crisis expresses itself in all sorts of ways, in rising rates of youth suicide, record overdoses, random acts of street violence, months-long waiting lists for children's therapists, mask meltdowns, QAnon. Political science professor at University of Nebraska, Kevin Smith, found in a survey that 40% said they were stressed out about politics. A fifth or more reported losing sleep, being fatigued, or suffering depression because of politics. As many as a quarter of respondents reported self-destructive or compulsive behaviors, including saying and writing things they later regret, making bad decisions, ignoring other priorities. In some ways, this is surprising, says Michelle. Most people aren't political junkies, like she is, like I am. As a political scientist, Yana Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan wrote in the New York Times, most Americans, upward to 80 to 85%, follow politics casually or not at all. Smith doesn't dispute this, but he speculates that even those who aren't intensely interested in politics are still affected by the ambient climate of hatred, chaos, and dysfunction. What I think is going on is that politics is unavoidable, he said. It is essentially a permanent part of the background noise of our lives. So what do we do about this? These dark times we live in. I say that we need to respond to that which is in us, the spirit that calls for our courage, for our compassion and love. And that brings me to Longfellow's last stanza of his poem. As we noted, he gave a pretty dark view, which is understandable. I think many of us can relate to his anguish to various degrees. But he ends his poem with perhaps a surprising note of optimism. His last stanza. Then peal the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Now I know the word God can be troublesome for some of you, if not many of you, knowing Unitarian Universalists. Although there are many Unitarian Universalists who believe in God, and many who do not. But I want you to listen to Longfellow's words, not just with your ears, but with your heart, with all your heart. For we know that Henry speaks a different language. But when he hears the bells on Christmas Day, Henry is reminded of the Christmas story in the Gospel of Luke, of the story of Joseph taking his wife, Mary, to a manger where the animals are, where their child is born, a child whom to many is considered the most important person in human history. And then we see the shepherds who see an angel and are afraid. But the angel reassures them and announces the good news of the birth of this child. So the shepherds go to see the child, hearing a heavenly host speak of peace on earth. To me, this is a story of hope, this Christmas story. For Jesus represents to me all children who are special and holy. And as long as we have life to do good work and be good people, there is hope. As long as we have a spark of courage, compassion, and love inside of us, there is hope. And as long as we have young people who are wise and courageous and committed to the principles of our democracy, we have hope. I want to close my sermon today by showing a clip from a movie called Detroit. It was directed by Catherine Bigelow. The movie is about the riot in 1967, the story that I referred to earlier. It shows how the riot was instigated and how it created all this chaos, fires, smoke, violence, people being hurt, people being killed. But it's also a story of a black black rhythm and blues group called the Dramatics. And while the riot was going on, the Dramatics were getting ready to go on stage at the Fox Theater in Detroit, which is the biggest theater in Michigan. Actually, Kalamazoo has the second biggest, Miller Auditorium. Little factoid. Anyway, they're about to go on to follow Martha Evers and the Vandellas. You remember? And so they sing, but after they sing, the police come in and they tell everybody in the theater to leave because of the riot. So they lose their big chance to become known. And then these members of the Dramatics go out into the chaos and the violence, and they finally find themselves in the Algiers Motel, which was an integrated hotel, but just a few years before, it was segregated. It only allowed white people. So they ended up, members of this group, singing group, in a room with two white women. And one of the people there, I hesitate to say man, but he's a 17-year-old boy, has a starter pistol. And he looks out the window down below and sees the police. And he's so afraid of the police, so hates the police, he wants to chase them away, so he fires a starter pistol, which can't hurt anybody, right? But he thinks it's going to frighten them, but instead does just the opposite. Two police come in, charge the hotel. And they round up the men and the women, they slam them against the wall. They beat up the men, and they stripped the women naked. And then, to make a long story short, 2 of the men are murdered. The 17-year-old boy was later discovered dead. It seems pretty obvious that he was killed by the police, although it was never proven. One of the dramatics, the lead singer, Larry Cleveland Reed, is close to death, but he's helped to a hospital by a police officer. And I want to emphasize, my nephew is a police officer. The vast majority of police are trying to do the best they can. It's one of the most difficult jobs imaginable. They're called upon to solve social problems that they can't solve. You know, the problems of racism, poverty, education, healthcare, environmental degradation, in the neighborhood. They can't solve these problems. They can't solve the problems of lead, which creates young people having more volatile personalities. They're called upon to respond to emergencies in the moment. And it's really difficult to do the right thing a lot of times. But sometimes they're bad police, really bad cops, just like they're bad teachers, bad plumbers, bad ministers, you name it, even bad presidents. So these 2 cops, the one cop in particular, are pretty families hearing that verdict. So the clip will start right at the time when I think we'll hear the verdict, but it's right at that time. I want to say about this movie, I saw it in the movie theater. It's the most frightening movie I've ever seen in my life, the most disturbing. It's very hard to watch. In fact, I tried to watch it again, preparing for this sermon. And just really frightening. But it's also important. I think every American citizen should watch it because it reflects the problems we have with race and poverty, with the police and the community of color, that kind of thing. We still live with these problems. But the other thing is desperately unhappy is the riot, how sad it is, how tragic. There is that hope at the very end. That's one way to show you, the hope at the very end. And like I said, it begins at the end of the trial. We hear John Connors, and I met John Connors, representative from Detroit. He was a gentleman. He had an unfortunate end to his career, but I always admired him. He actually tried to stop the riots by being a flatbed truck and talking to the riots right out there in jeopardy. So he speaks about the police needing to be responsible for violent illegal behavior. But then after that, we see the dramatics, and this is sometime later. I don't know how much later after the riot, maybe a month or a year, I'm not sure. But they have regrouped and they're performing again. And we see in the concert in the back is Larry Reed watching them. After the concert, one of the dramatics tried to convince Larry to come and join them to do concerts and cut some records. Larry. God is not dead, nor is there courage, compassion, and love. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth and goodwill to all.
Kurt's a little taller than I am. Thank you so much. I do think I have an announcement, just a reminder. After the service today, Trista will be leading another section of the book, the Thomas More book. So if you are interested in that, please, we'll come back into the sanctuary. And our final hymn this morning is Lean on Me. The words are up on the board, and Chris will help us get started. Go back to the chorus. Well, go back to the chorus. We need the choir. And now, since the struggle deepens, since evil abides and good does not yet prosper, let us gather what strength we have, what confidence and valor that our small victories will end in triumph, and the world awaited be a world attained. Go in peace. Thank you.
Yeah.